At the American University in Washington, D.C., we're talking about U.S. policy toward the Balkans and issues relating to the European Union with Eleftherios Mihail, Professor of Peace and Conflict Resolution, which is part of the School of International Service. Welcome to The View from Washington, and today we are at the American University here in Washington, D.C., talking to Professor Eleftherios Mihail. Welcome.
Thank you, Daniel.
Eleftherios, tell me, when you look at decisions made here in Washington, when you look at U.S. foreign policy, you're a professor of international peace and conflict resolution. How do you perceive the U.S. approach in this regard when applied to situations, conflicts around the world, perhaps in comparison to approach by European Union or the UN or international organizations in general?
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for having me today. First of all, to say that very challenging question to begin with, but a very good question, which I believe will be connected to your audience as well. First, we have to take the United States and how U.S. foreign policy looks. Certain conflicts, whether that has to do with Balkans, Libya, Syria, how do they handle them, what kind of conflict management mechanism they put in place, and then let's see if we can compare it with the European one, which is even much more complex because we're talking about so many entities within the EU member states.
Right.
And that makes things, when it comes to foreign policy, very complex. Especially recalling from the Balkan experience, that can even put more challenges into play. From my viewpoint as an analyst, U.S. foreign policy and the way U.S. approaches very complex situations are sometimes on the very shallow level. That has to do with political interests, investments. That also has to do with a number of other factors. For example, is the crisis a priority in U.S. foreign policy, and at what level? Is, for example, Libya a priority? Is Syria a priority? And again, at what level? Is it on top of the list, in the middle of the list, or in the very bottom? Linking this to the case of the Balkans, I'm afraid to say, but at the same time I have to say this, that whether it's Bosnia or Serbia, it's U.S. foreign policy look at those cases at the very low priority level. It's very stable region for the time being, and I think it will continue to be so.
Right.
That has to do also with how the U.S. will get engaged in these post-conflict zones later on.
Right, and you know, you were mentioning the Balkans and whether different crises around the world are important or politically in the news or draws U.S. attention. Doesn't that also imply that perhaps the policy itself during crisis situations might be also colored by maybe a media presentation of the situation, or do you feel that there is a even-handed or decision-making process based on all the facts, or is it a little bit more tainted by political and other considerations when dealing with it?
Very good. Let's begin with the media. Media, as you know, can be very influential, not only in the United States but everywhere. How do we get our information? How do we choose the sources and all of that? And at least here in the United States, based on my own experience, my own analysis, it's we have a number of agencies, depending which agency you collect your information, that can easily guide the way you will respond to a situation, the way you will lobby, if you decide to lobby your own representatives in the House, in the Senate, in the government, or if you decide not to do so. So the media is very influential. There is no doubt about it. And again, linking that to the case of the Balkans, the way that media can influence, media, let me put it this way, media can influence the way the U.S. and U.S. citizens perceive the Balkans and the situation in the Balkans, whether that has to do with the Republic of Serbia, whether that has to do with Serbia and Kosovo, the status of Kosovo, or even post-conflict in Bosnia and its the Dayton implementation.
Right, and in that regard, how do you perceive U.S. goals in the Balkans on the whole? Right now, or well, I know in the past certainly is to stabilize the crisis, but maybe how has that evolved a little bit to today?
If we look this chronologically, for example, around 1994, 1995, towards the end of the civil war in the Balkans, particularly in Bosnia, the U.S. involvement was very active for a number of reasons. And of course, as you know, media was very influential in getting U.S. foreign policy, getting President Clinton to get involved. Following 95 to about 98, the U.S. was still very engaged to some degree. Beyond that point, following the timeline, the chronology from 98, 2000, 2001, considering 9/11 in 2001, I believe that U.S. foreign policy in the Balkans is kind of part of a second tier, part of a second category of importance, if you like, to look at it that way, is not a priority for the United States. Whether that's fortunate or unfortunate is a different question, of course. But let's look, for example, U.S. influence in the region following 9/11. Very, almost the direction, the intentions, the directions, meaning of foreign policy, was towards Middle East, towards Afghanistan, towards Syria, and much less about the Balkans. Coming into the 2009, 2010, occasionally we see some U.S. involvement through statements, media statements, when there are elections and in the aftermath of the elections, but nothing beyond that point.
Well, yeah, and that's an interesting point, that certainly 9/11 was a climax of, U.S. Involvement in the Middle East and perception of where U.S. leadership should be. And in a way, I suppose the policy that was implemented in the 90s was just kind of continued rolling on as far as Washington was concerned. And any kind of reanalysis of the policy almost, hasn't taken place. Because there wasn't that much attention anymore to that part of the world.
We can also look at the number of funding that used to go to the region, which eventually declined to much, much lower numbers nowadays.
That's right, I guess, and even lower yet with the USAID also cutting back its funding too. And I suppose they feel that the region is to some extent stable. Now the EU is trying to get Serbia involved, and hopefully will kind of maybe take over the role of a stabilizing force in that part of the world. Fascinating thing about the EU, during we talk about the Balkans, during the 1990s, certain powers in Europe and influential countries did want to get involved, and then the U.S. kind of took over, and it was really more Washington's approach to the conflict that dominated the situation eventually. Do you feel that now people in Washington are a little bit more willing to let the EU take over in terms of its influence in the Balkans, or at least work with them a little bit more, to cede power to some extent to European powers?
Yeah, this is my hope. Serbia is part of Europe. Serbia's orientation should look towards the European Union. I believe that the people of Serbia have a lot to gain